There's obviously a lot of changes taking place within the solar system, but the focus of this presentation, and all that was the preface for what we'll get into now, is how human beings are affected by these changes. Emotional states. Pattern recognition is what we're looking at here with the connection between peaks in solar cycles, solar activities, times of solar maximum, and the launching of new battles, wars, conflicts, false flag events, specifically at certain times. And we're going to be looking at a number of individuals that have provided information about the quantitative information that everybody has access to in terms of these solar cycles. And Alexander Chavinsky is one of the most historical figures. He was an acclaimed scientist in Russia who studied the biological effects of the sun and universe. In particular, how mouse changes in human behavior correlated to sunspot cycles. In 1915, he started to look in this direction at the effects of the sun. He spent a summer observing the sun and first hypothesized the effect of periodic changes in solar activity on the organic world. In 1916, he entered the front lines of World War I, and it was there that he first discovered that battles tended to wax and wane with the strength of solar flares and geomagnetic storms. He constructed what's called the Index of Mass Human Excitability, which traced the incidence of wars, revolutions, riots, expeditions, and migrations from 500 BC to 1922 AD. And he was jailed for his research by Stalin in 1942. He asked Chvatsky to retract his writings in solar cycles, which contradicted Soviet theories of the reasons for the Russian revolutions of 1905 and 1917. So he did 8 years in a forced labor gulag, followed by 8 years of Soviet rehabilitation, where he then conducted scientific work in the coal mines. Of course, Russia did commemorate Alexander Chvatsky, but it was a little too late. But his research spawned other studies. For example, Raymond Wheeler from the University of Kansas confirmed that the pattern, in fact, does span human history as far back as 2,500 years. He found that intense magnetic upswings directly affect the human brain and at times drove mankind into deadly emotional tantrums and frenzied killing sprees. He also wrote a book entitled Climate, the Key to Understanding Business Cycles. Edward Dewey found his information and statistically analyzed it. He is the founder of the Foundation for the Study of Cycles. Dewey validated the existence of these war cycles, and he described the 4 components of Chizevsky's 11-year cycle and their appropriate links. And this kind of illustrates the 4 cycles. The blue section, the yellow, the red, and the yellow again. Dewey wrote in 1970 that knowing that wars have a cyclical nature related to sunspot cycles implies that they have a common cause, and therefore they are predictable. If so, maybe they can be avoided. But for the powers that be, and their perspective on things, events can be staged. People can be manipulated, especially if they're out of balance and out of alignment with their own truth. Dr. Robert Becker and Dr. Friedman also looked at this information and found that more people flip out at times of increased geomagnetic activity and that there was an increase in psychiatric hospital admissions. Now, Carol Moore has a website entitled Sunspots and Activist Strategy, and I'm going to read a quote that I feel is very pertinent to what we just discussed and also where we could be going. Governmental leaders often respond to mass protests by starting wars to unite the people and suppress dissent. Also, they themselves may get caught up in the mania caused by negative ionization and launch irrational wars. Activists since the 1960s, like myself, have lived through several sunspot heights. From 68 to 71, 79 to 82, 89 to 1992, and the 2000 to 2003 periods. We can look back at our own experiences of several years of frenzied activity with big meetings and big protests, when the least indignation might lead to riots, rebellions, revolutions, civil wars. And we can remember other periods of years where once vital organizations declined or died. Meetings and protests were fewer and smaller. And lethargic people seemed to be willing to endure repression. Then, just when few remaining activists were in deep despair, a magical resurgence of activity. If governmental intelligence agencies are on their toes, they have bookmarked this page, and they have experts studying the effects of sunspots on activism so they can squelch or even redirect such energies when they rise again. There are many examples of this. So it's hardly silly for activists also to look at the evidence that these cycles have influenced all of human history and to learn the implications of these cycles for activist organizing today and in the future. I've been talking to this guy over email for several years, and I feel that the work of Dr. Burl Payne needs to reach a larger audience, and I'm hoping that through this presentation, more people will look at what Dr. Burl Payne has been researching for several years, actually since the 1970s. Dr. Burl Payne is a PhD in psychology and a master's in physics. In the 1980s, he found that the start of the warring behavior occurred on the ascent or the descent of the sunspot cycle, and that the physical mechanism to trigger this was changes to the Earth's geomagnetic field, which affects brain rhythms and hormone balance of sensitive individuals. This is an illustration of that concept. This is a chart that he created showing where you can see here the conflicts, some of the conflicts beginning before the solar activity. You can see here examples of conflicts beginning after the peak in solar activity. So Burl Payne suggests that men have their own cycle. We know that women have a cycle that's connected to the moon. It's called PMS. And Burl suggests that men that are out of balance may have their own cycle called MMS, or male macho syndrome. And he believes that during this point in time, through an increase in solar activity, solar energy, that men receive an increase in testosterone in their physical bodies. He writes, quote, "Wars could be called a mass psychosis or a new disease, which is not caused by bacteria or a virus. If warring behavior is perceived as a previously unknown type of mass psychosis, then the means for dealing with it becomes different than those traditionally employed. And those means have not worked very well." It gets even deeper in his book, Planetary Influences. He observed that when Mars, Venus, and Mercury were near the Earth at the same time period, more sunspot numbers were likely to form, and more wars were more likely to start if the sunspot cycle was either on the ascending or descending part of the 11-year solar cycle. And he found that there's a correlation 85% of the time between periods when planets are relatively near the Earth and the production of sunspots and other solar activity. There's also a quote from a famous metaphysical teacher called George Gurdjieff, who said in the 1940s that war is the result of planetary influences. So we're now going to go over the evidence, the historical events that have taken place in different solar cycles, beginning in the late 18th century, around the time of the Revolutionary War. And we're going to have to abbreviate this for time. But what we can see in this particular chart, and there's many charts, it would take a half hour to get into all the things that took place between 1770 and 2013. But we saw events that led to the American Revolution in sunspot cycle number 2. In sunspot cycle 3, we see the American Revolution. We see the U.S. Constitution being written in the third solar cycle. Solar cycle 5, Napoleon conquers Europe, 1803 to 1806. And a lot of other things taking place in Europe. Solar cycles 8 through 10. And we see events that led to the Civil War, for example, in the United States, which ironically started 2 years after the 1859 Carnarvon event, where the grid went down. The grid that did exist at that point in time. We also saw revolts beginning in India, Italy, and China. Solar cycles 11 through 13. U.S. labor strikes, revolts in Sudan, First Indian Congress meets. 1893 to 95, Zulu Revolt, Cuban Revolution. And we see events that led to World War I, solar cycles 14 through 16. And as I said earlier, solar cycle 14 was double peaked, as they're projecting that this current solar cycle could be double peaked, 2013 and 2015. 1914 to 1919, First World War, Irish and Indian revolts, Russian Revolution, and the atom split. In 1929, by the way, during the peak in sunspots, the peak of the solar activity, we saw the Great Depression. We saw the stock market crash, rather, that led to the bottoming out of the Great Depression around 1933. During the same time period, we see Mussolini and Hitler rising to power, built on economic unrest and other revolts, formation of the Red Army, more mass civil disobedience in India. Now we're looking at events that led to World War II, solar cycle 17 to 19. Spanish Civil War, Germany and Japan start World War II. Japanese rape of Nanking, mass civil disobedience in India. U.S. still strike, 1947 to 1953. We see the Greek Civil War, Israeli-Arab War, India-Pakistan riots, Red Army wins China, Vietnam revolts, flying saucers start becoming more common throughout the United States. Following Project Paperclip, there's also a crash of a flying saucer in Roswell during the peak of that solar cycle. The CIA was created out of the OSS, and we saw the launch of the Korean War. And we see other events following that. The late 60s took place during solar maximum, solar cycle 20, 1967 to 1969. And by the way, these years that I'm reading, that's the years that we had the peak. It usually goes from 3 to 5 years. Each solar cycle, it varies. Sometimes it's short, sometimes it's a little bit longer. Height of the Vietnam War, peace demonstrations, worldwide student uprising, Czechoslovakian uprising, USSR invasions, in U.S. inner-city riots, Israeli-Arab War, Woodstock and height of hippie movement, uprising in France, Prague spring moon landing, MLK and Bobby Kennedy assassinated. And there's a lot more things that take place in the next cycle. For example, when Afghanistan was invaded by Russia, took place during solar cycle 21. The Iraq-Iran war began during that solar cycle. The Shah of Iran was overthrown. In the 1988 to 1992 period, we see a number of other events that are extremely historic. For example, the USSR begins to pull out from Afghanistan, and we see the staged collapse of the Soviet Union. We also saw the Tiananmen Square incident in China, and the Berlin Wall fell, the dissolution of the Soviet Union. Iraqi troops invade Kuwait. Bush Sr. gives New World Order speech. The Gulf War begins. We also saw the LA riots, all during solar cycle 22. In the next solar cycle 23, and there's a lot of things that started to kick off as we approach the millennium point in time. For example, the WTO protests in 1999, and other protests that were starting to increase at that point in time, and yet 9/11 hadn't even happened yet. But already the masses were reacting to these changes that they were feeling in their bodies. We saw the worldwide Y2K scare. Heroin overdoses skyrocket in Portland. Bush is given the election by the Supreme Court. And the 2001 to 2003 period. September 11th, 2001. You'll have to use that typo there. So-called war on terrorism begins. Invasion of Afghanistan. Patriot Act signed into law. The invasion of Iraq. Because, again, these aren't wars. These are invasions. And, of course, mass protests against the war. Before they invaded Iraq, as we all remember, record numbers of protests, as well as afterwards. As we started going into the minimum, alternative media continued to expand, but protest numbers got smaller and smaller and smaller, obviously, especially after the so-called election of the last so-called president. So SolarFlex, 2001 to 2002. We can see from this chart that solar activity starts to ramp up right before 9/11 and continues to maintain its strength throughout the period of time where they invaded Afghanistan. And it starts to declined slightly in activity in 2002, but this is still the center of the maximum portion. We started going in the minimum phase around 2003, 2004. This is what we have seen in the last couple of years in this cycle, number 24. Descent in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia. Obama overthrows Libya. By the way, 8 years to the day that Bush attacked Iraq. Bush attacked Iraq March 19th, 2003. Libya was struck March 19th, 2011. And of course, we started to see media coverage of protests all over the world, not only in the Middle East, but Europe, China, and many other countries. And the United States, not limited to Occupy Wall Street. Also during this period, we saw Fukushima. In March of 2011, President Barack Obama signed the NDAA, Syrian Civil War. North Korea, the controlled wild card, points missiles at South Korea and threatens Hawaii and Japan. And of course, after the biggest solar flare this year that took place on April 11th, 2013, we saw the Boston staged false flag bombing. Engineered at a specific point in the timeline where people are most likely to react emotionally with fear to such an event. So there are also trends with economic cycles and the sun. And this chart was put together by Michael Manderville. And the arrows that I put here indicate the recession periods. So here we see on the left side of the screen, we see the Great Depression, which began during a solar peak. And we see other events, other recessions. This chart is 1986 to 2003. And we see the Bush Senior recession right here, and the dot-com bubble bursting right here. And when I looked at this chart, a couple things came to mind. Because during solar minimums, there's less human activity, or as Stravinsky calls it, human excitability. So when I saw that in 1913, there was a record low numbers of sunspots that occurred in that year. That was the year the Federal Reserve was created. If we look at 2008, that's when the banker bailout was initiated. Also a record low sunspot count year. Less activity, less expected response from human beings, less expected protests, more times to launch things when you don't want people to react to things that you launch. So they use the maximum cycle, and they also use the minimum. And notice how Occupy Wall Street took a couple of years to get moving after this 2008 launched the banker bailout scheme. In late 2011, sunspots increased, and that was around the same time period we saw an increase in protests and other things. So this has also been discussed by Forbes magazine, who published this headline in 2011. Riots, wild markets. Do space storms drive us mad? And believe it or not, we were just talking about the Federal Reserve. They quote a study that the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta conducted in 2003, where they found that such storms could affect the stock market, as traders were more likely to make pessimistic choices. Their report states that unusually high levels of geomagnetic activity have a negative and statistically and economically significant effect on the following week's stock returns for all U.S. stock market indexes. In addition to changes in the economy, cycles of war, there are changes that we see within the climate, even though this is not being admitted by the UN's IPCC, because it violates their official view of what's causing global warming. But here's an equation provided by Mitch Batros as to how sunspots affect the climate. Sunspots affect the solar flares, which affects the magnetic field, which affects shifting ocean and jet stream currents, which causes extreme weather and human disruption.